My name is Amy Dryden. I'm Director of Strategic Innovations at AEA. And as Kellen mentioned, I'm going to talk about leveraging energy efficiency and electrification funding for different projects. You've heard a lot this morning. I've really appreciated all the presentations on like policy and different programs, technical aspects and strategies of how to approach retrofits. So I'm going to bring some of it together, hopefully tying it up a bit and have some conversations. I'll try to touch on answer the question, forget who it was from, I'm sorry, maybe Charlie, on cost effectiveness in different programs. Let me get to my, hold on, sorry. Okay. So we've been talking a lot about retrofits, and just to set the stage, you've heard the benefits, you've heard the challenges, but building electrification is advancing, I would say, pretty rapidly for the building industry. It's not an industry that has been known to move quickly. The number of programs for electrification retrofits is increasing, and so these are getting paired up, added on to energy efficiency, where we're kind of building out the available funding within existing programs and programs that are specifically focused on electrification. As we think about these programs and fundings, like the cycles are going to vary. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of like navigating this. This is a lot of what we do at AEA, and we like to call it like the funding Tetris, to how things all get lined up. And the last thing I just want to call out, like there's not a one size fits all for all these retrofits. You've just heard 3 different case studies from 3 different organizations, different building types, different strategies, all with the goal of improving the housing, getting benefits to the tenants, but had to approach it differently. So this can be, you know, a layer in terms of how do we think about approaching the retrofits. The other thing I'll just touch on, just in a reference to maybe Tom's comment to Mehmet, is like when we're looking at retrofits, we also have to think about what is that expanded scope of work. Where are we triggering code upgrades? Where can we avoid triggering code upgrades? Where do we definitely need to do the code upgrades from like health and safety standpoint? And all of these things are kind of under consideration. What I like to think about is just kind of the project approaches. You know, with a number of different programs, as you heard, a number of different property owners with a variety of portfolios. And so there's different ways we can think about approaching our retrofits. Sometimes it is in progress, and this isn't quite what Diana was saying, but there are some folks in progress where maybe the design is already done with gas, but there's an incentive or a program that can really drive a change, and there's an appetite for that change within that organization. There's also full rehab, so that can be an ACT rehab, 15-year resyndication, associated with some other scope of work, but really when you get to go in and address the building holistically. Phased, this is definitely something we're looking at a lot in terms of how to, I would say maybe like stretch investment and stretch capital investments in programs where we can look at the evaluation in phase 1 to ensure we make smart decisions up front and consider full electrification over time, whether it's building by building, whether it's appliance by appliance, but we make the smart decisions today to reduce capital investment over time. And so it can also balance with capital investments or reserves, et cetera. The last one there, unit turnover, is not something we've seen at an electrification perspective. We're all used to seeing it on the efficiency side of things, right? For appliance change outs, upgrade of the refrigerator, right? Or changing the carpet, like these painting, these kind of maintenance and repairs. And so we're actively investigating and looking at like, how do we support this for unit turnover? So these are the different kinds of retrofits or approaches we can have to a retrofit, and how do those start to align with different fundings? So there is a plethora of funding programs in California, and that is at this simultaneously like great and very challenging. Like I said, it's the Tetris model of trying to figure out how these work. Many of them focus on energy efficiency and some focus on electrification. Some we have federal funding that are coming down, and most of these are energy efficiency driven programs, kind of like measure by measure. Then we have statewide programs that come from a diversity of sources. I saw some comments about the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities, AHSC, which actually now is kind of almost requiring only funding all electric buildings. SGIP, which is focused on specific measures. Then folks like programs like LIWIP, holistic program. We also have tax credit, like the low income housing tax credits or Go Green financing. There are more financing options that I also saw mentioned in the chat, and Heather mentioned the LIHTC program. We are also seeing programs come through air districts. Both Bay Area Quality Management District and South Coast Air Quality Management Districts have programs that are supporting electrification and EVs from an emissions-driven perspective. And then we have more regional programs. So whether it's municipal programs or regional energy network programs like BayREN's Bambi program that we've been hearing a lot about today, all of them are more regionally focused. Oops. And so that is a lot of programs to navigate to understand like what is happening in this landscape and what can I fund? Because all of those programs have a different, they're guided by different strategies, different metrics. So what building type they serve. We've heard a lot about NOAAs today, naturally occurring affordable housing. So some programs will support low income with income restrictions, and some are more broad. Some are targeted at owner or resident. Some are no cost or shared cost. We have a lot of geographic targeting, whether it's a service territory of that utility or of that regional energy network, or whether it's a vulnerable community population where they're targeting DACs. And the metrics. So there was a question earlier about like cost effectiveness. Some of these programs are driven by GHG emissions. So the low income weatherization program, as an example, is funded by the Greenhouse Gas Emission Reductions Fund. And so it's looking at reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is the metric. And that's what the incentive is based on. So it's not a traditional cost effectiveness model. Some of our IOU, our traditional IOU programs, are cost effective. And that does limit what they can deliver on. There are some weatherization measures that are really, I'm going to use the word widget based, where it's like for like kind of change out. And those have some back end cost effectiveness or savings to investment ratio behind them to support whether or not that measure can be implemented. Then we also have programs like tech for retrofits that it's a market transformation program, and it is delivering and paying incentives on heat pump technologies. And so that does not have a cost effectiveness kind of metric behind it, because it's really geared toward that target. And then we have things like low income housing tax credits that are very broad based. So again, all of these things kind of add up to think about like, how do I start putting these together? So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects and examples that pull on these, that are focused on multifamily, that deal with income, talk about geographic targeting, different metrics, and kind of mix and match these measures. Because of all of that complexity of what they do, we really do need to layer. We really need to layer all of these programs. And as Heather mentioned, kind of having that policy in place or having those processes in place or strategies in place to enable layering is really key to make these projects effective. Because they can address different aspects. We really want to, when we're going to upgrade our buildings, we want to do as much as possible. One that gives us the greatest benefit, it's the most economical, and it's the least disruptive, right? And it's not just, it's a layering these dollars amount that's important, because it allows us to layer these benefits or these goals. So you've heard a lot about efficiency, right? When we do efficiency, we can improve the comfort of a building or a home, which can also reduce requirements for equipment that goes in. So we can have smaller equipment, which can minimize impacts on our electrical infrastructure, or can minimize our capital costs because we get to have smaller equipment. And we can really ensure that by layering those incentive dollars, we can have greater benefits, hopefully for tenants as well as owners. And this is just an example of kind of considerations. And I'm going to go through a couple of loosely using the term case studies, but when we're thinking about layering programs, right, you're thinking about that geography. Where does my project lie? With LIWIP, it has geographical limitations. So is my project in a disadvantaged community or low income, or is it farm worker? Can I also do that with ESA, which is in IOU territory, and BAMBI, which is in the Regional Energy Network 9-county Bay Area? How does my income eligibility line up for that? Am I limited? Is my project market rate or NOAA, which may not always meet income eligibility requirements for those low income programs? And one of the things where we like to kind of think about how things mix and match is on those measures in electrification. How do we take owner and tenant, benefits and goals and figure out how to match these together so we can have the greatest benefit and the greatest impact? So you heard a number of different case studies today in terms of how folks layered a lot of different funding sources, and I'm not going to get into a number of the things like Diana was talking about in terms of loans from local jurisdictions or things like that. I'm going to be focused more on the incentive program layering. So I'm going to take us through a couple of options. And then based on the conversation, I also threw in one slide at the end where we can talk about kind of understanding costs and benefits of electrification. So the first one's high-rise comprehensive. Then I'm going to talk about a low-rise garden style where it's partial and where we're starting to think about next phase. And the last one is a walk-up building, but it's a phased approach. So the first one is this high-rise comprehensive. And you can see at the bottom there's 5 programs. You can also see it in the table. It's 120 units and 6 stories. This was one of I think it was like the second project of this owner where they were doing full electrification. They had been kind of going through this process to kind of like start moving through their projects and increasing their knowledge and understanding of how to achieve this. So they did some pretty comprehensive upgrades. You can see there under the scope of work, from high efficiency washing machines to central heat pump water heater was the domestic hot water for the residents. We had variable speed pump, recirc. Again, old buildings have old plumbing as well as old electrical, as Mehmet mentioned. And so we often are looking at ways to like repair and optimize that plumbing system so we can have that right distribution so you don't have somebody waiting for the hot water at the far end of the line. We did pipe insulation, crossover repair also to improve that comfort or that resident satisfaction in actually receiving hot water and the performance of the water heating system itself. Insulating the attic, common area heat pump and pipe insulation for that. So if you look on the right there at the table, I just kept it pretty simple and high level. You can have more conversation, but with LIWIP, just over 123,000 that was addressing electrification and energy efficiency. So I just tried to call out at least a high level here of what types of scope of work each of these programs can cover. So BayREN can also cover electrification and energy efficiency. The tech program that I mentioned is only space conditioning and water heating, heat pump technologies. That's it. I mean, I shouldn't say that's it. That's really fantastic. But it's focused on those 2 technologies of heat pumps. ESA CAM and ESA is energy efficiency based. So those were addressing some of those measures. And the total incentives of kind of bringing those all together covered 79% of the costs for that owner. So they were left with 21% to cover, which this makes it much more feasible for them to undertake. This is also like, will this always exist for owners that they can layer all 5 programs? Maybe, maybe not. I mentioned program cycles shift and change. Measures may shift and change, so it won't always be that all of these align. But I think a lot of the programs and policies are looking to have continuous funding for multifamily, so we don't have these gaps. We know it takes longer to plan to deliver on multifamily retrofits. But this was a great example of kind of pulling all these pieces together and figuring out, based on what's eligible for each of those measures, how to make it work. The next one is garden style. So this was a partial. And I put this one up here for a couple of reasons. One, it was very early on. This was done in 2017. which, like I said, the electrification activity is moving relatively quickly. So this was nascent in terms of like how our industry was moving and how many programs could fund it. So really LIWIP, the low income weatherization program, was supporting it, and they were doing a significant rehab. So they use TCAC and had the low income housing tax credits. So you can see the scope of work they did. One of the challenges they ran up against was electrical infrastructure capacity. And so they made the decision to retrofit all of the heat pump water, or not the heat pump water heaters, retrofit all of the water heaters with heat pump water heaters because it had the greatest financial benefit and savings. And they left the gas stoves in place. They have thought about like, oh, if we knew what we knew now from an indoor air quality, maybe we would have done stoves first and water heaters later. That said, we've also had conversations with them, knowing what we have known over the years and where technologies have evolved, looking at different ways to approach the National Electric Code calculations that Jack mentioned earlier. We may be able to navigate this where this was a partial back in 2017. And kind of our next iteration can be working with them, hopefully within that electrical infrastructure that they have on site, to be able to replace the stoves. So it's an interesting way to kind of get at the electrical infrastructure later with kind of increased knowledge and experience and ability to kind of navigate what's viable. That said, I don't have the costs here because it's really hard to kind of pull out these costs with such a significant rehab in terms of all that was contributed. But I did want to put up here just the savings perspective for you all to see. So obviously, negative kilowatt hour savings. We've heard that a lot. Our electrical loads are going to increase as we remove the gas appliances and replace them with electric. So we had significant therm savings, obviously, because we only have the units now, the stoves. The tenant received savings, and our tenant utility costs were 18%. And you can see in my note that that was also pre-solar offset. So these homes in the Central Valley were insulated, improved, new windows, new heat pump, had the cooling. And you can see in the chart there, even prior to the solar, which would offset a significant amount of their costs, they were receiving savings. So this is really great to see. I will say, as you've heard, you don't always see this. I'll talk a little bit about rates in a moment. You just get through these couple of slides. The last one I want to talk about, again, just to show different strategies and how things were layered and how folks are looking to kind of maximize their kind of financials as well as the process and leverage incentives. So this was a 9-unit, 2 stories. It's a walk-up I showed you a picture of earlier. And I put it into 3 phases. I don't have any dollars amount for phase 1, roughly completed in 2018. The project was acquired in 2017, and they installed solar panels and changed out the sub panels to have greater capacity. There was a lot of costs involved because they kept getting into these higher tiers. So rates have such a significant impact on what we're paying, and it's out of our hands in terms of like ensuring that there is a rate structure that is super supportive of electrification. So we put in the solar panels to reduce that initial cost, and then undertook electrification in 2 phases. One was completed in October 21, where it's replacing gas heaters with the package terminal heat pumps, the Efficas that we saw earlier in Mehmet's presentation. Those are going to have like little rectangular suitcases through the wall. They did some lighting upgrades and installed a blown-in insulation attic. And when I put wall up there, sorry, wall was in the 3rd phase. So with that first phase, kind of phase 2 here, that total cost was about $42,000. And with the incentives, you can see Bambi was only available then to support that, offset $62,000. This is a small owner, and so there's our challenges with small ownership in terms of ability to leverage a number of different incentive programs. So then come, June of 2022, the project's wrapping up now. Bambi and Tech were available. So what they undertook there, again, apologies, the wall insulation and low flow shower heads, but they replaced the gas water heaters, with heat pump water heaters. And so based on those cumulative incentives, both leveraging Bambi and then the tech that can support the heat pump technology, the owner cost was down to 8,000, just over 8,000 from the 38,000. So 2 programs leveraged there. And I think I've got like 2 more slides and get through those, Kellen. So I wasn't planning on putting this in, but I threw it in just based on the conversation today, and just wanted to speak to it. You know, we are looking to do a lot of benchmarking, particularly on electrification retrofits, to understand what's happening pre and post. And I will say overall, there is energy reduction, right? We have more efficient appliances, and so we do see energy reduction consistently. On average, we also will see obviously greenhouse gas emissions because we're eliminating fossil fuels. So on average, maybe 35%, kind of depends on how much, if it's full electrification or partial electrification. Many of the projects, we also try to include PV. That is also a great way to kind of ensure that lower rate structure or kind of like impact on utilities because of the variation in electric and gas utility costs. It's really challenging. If folks are on a care rate, there's a lot more confidence in that will be kind of continuous, and we'll definitely see the savings pre and post. But one of the things I just wanted to call out quickly, and I apologize, I'm not sure who mentioned this in the chat, was like, how do we think about cost? And we often look at pre and post. And I will say, just for myself, my utility rate costs last year are not the same that I'm paying this year, much less if I'm doing an electrification retrofit, what I'd be paying next year. So if I did a pre and post, it's a little bit challenging because my rate structures are not the same. And so we've been exploring this approach of doing kind of avoided cost calculation when we look at, like, if we didn't do anything, if we took that building as it was and carried it into the future, what would those costs be? So what would I be paying next year if I didn't change out any of my appliances and I didn't upgrade them and didn't electrify and didn't insulate and didn't put PV? And what am I paying with all of those things? And so trying to put that more into a little bit closer to kind of like those projected costs. And that's a helpful kind of metric, I think, or at least a framework for us to think about. So I just wanted to share that. And lastly, before I close out here, what I heard today a lot is, you know, what about technical assistance and support and how to navigate programs and technologies? And yes, I think a lot of the multifamily programs have technical assistance built into them, you know, and yes, disclosure AA is part of a lot of those. Also want to say we are also looking to support what we're calling as the Electrification Knowledge Hub. A lot of this is supported through the Tech Clean California initiative, where we're putting out information on whole building science, multifamily electrification 101, how to do a retrofit directed at contractors, design teams, architects, as well as property owners. 2 different courses, different perspectives, right? As well as heat pump water heater design and installation, like how to navigate a number of the challenges of individual heat pump water heaters. So there are more resources that are growing in this area in terms of funding, in terms of education and training, to support moving our industry in this direction. And so lastly, I'll just leave you with this. They're possible. We need to reduce our loads to make our equipment smaller, easier, and cheaper. It can result in smaller renewable systems. We really need to do comprehensive scope of work, and it can be offset by layering programs, as you've heard throughout the morning. And really, we can increase our knowledge level so we can be more effective as part of a design team, et cetera. And really, we need to be creative in our approach. None of these retrofits are the same from building to building. And there's different kind of strategies we can do to figure out where to locate equipment, what do we need to upgrade, how to navigate electrical infrastructure, so we can achieve these goals and have benefits to the tenants. And that's it.
Awesome.
Thank you, Kellen.
Thanks so much, Amy. Yeah, that was great. I feel like you answered Jenny's question here about, you know, basically there's a lot to consider, and, you know, are there technical resources out there for, especially smaller, like landlords, property owners, and property organizations. Here's a question from Tom. How can we project how much resident electricity costs will go up if we replace furnaces with heat pumps in units with no active cooling? I think that's a complicated question. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, what we do is kind of take the cost today or kind of consumption today and kind of like project that forward with assumed increased rates, right? But when we're looking at electrification, we have to rely on models. And all of us who model or kind of deal with models, and those of you know Nehemiah will also say this phrase, Nehemiah Stone, like all models are wrong, but some models are good. And so we do have to rely on models for like projected loads for electrification when we're changing out appliances. And so we utilize models that are pretty good, and we can utilize that and kind of apply the same rates for the electricity, for the existing condition and the future condition. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it can help start giving us a framework.